Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to Marsh & McLennan's Global Risk Trends Review for 2021. My name is Sarah Robson, and I'm President and CEO of Marsh Canada and Marsh McLennan Country Corporate Officer for Canada. The global pandemic and the events of the past year and a half have demonstrated more than ever the need for awareness and resilience in the face of potential global risks. Today, we're going to explore some of the critical global risks affecting businesses and society, discuss how these risks affect our lives, livelihoods, and the health of global economies, and highlight some of the enormous structural challenges we face. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. They represent all four of our Marsh McLennan businesses: Marsh, Guy Carpenter, Mercer, and Oliver Wyman. Richard Smith Bingham is Executive Director, Marsh McLennan Insights. He is based in London and leads a global team that helps frame Marsh McLennan's thinking on big risks and other transformational agenda. He is a long-term contributor to the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report. Jackie Parchment is CEO of Mercer Canada. She is based in Toronto and is a passionate advocate and frequent speaker on issues relating to diversity and inclusion, including promoting racial and gender diversity in corporate Canada. Anya Sri Skandaraja is a managing director of Guy Carpenter and leads GC Strategic Advisory in Canada. Anya has broad knowledge and experience in financial and stochastic analysis related to insurance and reinsurance, and led Guy Carpenter Canada's catastrophic modeling team for more than 10 years. Rob Bailey is responsible for climate resilience within Marsh McLennan Advantage, where he analyzes the implications of climate change for policymaking and business operations and strategy. He has more than 20 years of professional experience spanning consulting, policy, and research. Jonathan Weeks is a Senior Vice President with Marsh Canada. He is based in Toronto and is a recognized expert in cyber risk. He has extensive experience in underwriting cyber liability, technology errors and emissions, and architects and engineers' professional liability risks. The Global Risk Report is produced annually by the World Economic Forum with the support of Marsh McLennan and other partners. This is our 16th year of supporting the report, which represents the perspectives and input from almost 700 experts from around the world across 35 core risks. Risks are identified in 5 risk categories across economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technological risks. You can go online and download the Global Risk Report for specific deep dives and areas of focus. And today, we're going to focus in areas that are specifically relevant to the Canadian context. With that, let me turn it over to Richard Smith Bingham, who leads the Global Risk Report efforts globally for Marsh McLennan. Richard?
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. If we could move to the next slide, please. And good morning, everyone. In this opening segment, I'm going to touch on some of the forces that are driving global risks these days and the top concerns presented in the 2021 report that we did with the World Economic Forum. I think to set this up, it's perhaps useful to view the current sort of macro level risk landscape as having 2 overlapping parts. On the one side, we have this complex fallout from a protracted pandemic, still with multiple unknown permutations. And on the other, we have sort of old risks on steroids, accelerated, exacerbated, and reshaped by the current crisis. And we need to be very conscious of both and where they intersect. And this can make for a pretty choppy story, but let me touch on a few threads that illustrate the uncertain and uneven nature of the recovery, both domestically and internationally, which of course has consequences for industry, societies, and geopolitical relationships as well. Next slide, please. So beyond the blizzard of data on this slide, the headline message being touted by media and markets at the moment is that we're getting on top of this extraordinary pandemic and that national economies are rebounding faster than we had expected 6 months ago. But as the doom and gloom risk person on this call, or even a what if person, I sort of propose that we temper this orthodoxy with some of the other data and analyses and keep a close lookout for the less desirable eventualities. After all, the clear lesson from the pandemic so far is to expect the unexpected. So just looking at those, the COVID-19 cases, we've seen global daily numbers peaking in January, halving by March, and then back up to the same peak in early May. Earlier in the year, up in Europe and India, and down and Latin America, and down in North America and the UK. Now better in Europe and India, but rising in sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia. Latin America still having a rough time of it. New waves are almost certain later this year, and most likely complicated by a harder flu season. Different UK analyses, and I say this because the data was revealed just a few days ago, suggest that my country may see between 20,000 and 200,000 deaths over the next 12 months, depending on how effective the vaccines are, how long immunity lasts, how transmissible new variants are, and how well people behave. So plenty of uncertainties there. Most countries have done well only at different phases or for different aspects of the response. And it's noteworthy that even outstanding performers such as Taiwan and Vietnam are struggling at the moment. COVID-related vaccines and hospitalizations and deaths may be more under control now, thanks to lockdowns and vaccine rollouts, but we're still facing a legacy of long COVID, reverberating mental health challenges, untreated conditions, and general burnout. And we have now this silent debate in governments now that we can keep hospitalization rates and deaths down. Goes back to how many deaths are acceptable in the name of opening up and economic growth. And while national governments are getting better at resolving the health crisis in their own countries, they're still finding it hard to collaborate effectively for global good, with levels of vaccine sharing very low. And it's also clear that herd immunity is not going to happen globally due to the slow vaccine rollout and vaccine hesitancy, and with the still scope for a really dangerous variant to take us back to the beginning all over again. I think under using a different lens here, in advanced economies, we have stock markets and house prices have boomed, but inequality has also exacerbated as well. And there are further economic discontinuities, each with their own sort of ramifications. Companies in some sectors have faced soaring demand, but constrained supply chains. In other sectors, businesses are still struggling to reopen. Then if we look across borders, we see there's much talk of new trade deals, tax harmonization plans, and new infrastructure initiatives. But we also see foreign investment and ownership constraints, local content requirements, export controls, non-tariff barriers for cross-border operations, travel bans, and an uptick in resource nationalism. And the World Bank is talking about a tale of two recoveries. And emerging and developing economies face much slower vaccination programs, a rise in the number of people in extreme poverty, and large debt overhangs. So for the erstwhile engines of global growth, the scars are going to be deeper and longer. And none of this is even to mention the sort of decline in democracy and civil liberties as governments everywhere take advantage of emergency powers and more security-oriented agenda to pursue more sort of dirigiste or authoritarian ambitions. They then throw in significant levels of societal unrest and more fraught superpower relations, huge leaps in technological deployment, and profound transition agendas such as decarbonisation and digitalisation, and there's plenty of scope for surprises yet to come. The next slide, please. So moving more specifically to the global risk report, we asked our sort of survey respondents, admittedly at a more challenging time last year, about their near-term global risk concerns beyond the pandemic. And you can see the results on this slide. They very much homed in on livelihood crises and lengthy stagnation. But it's also noteworthy to see extreme weather and cybersecurity up there as well. And we're going to explore these topics in more detail later in the presentation. On the next slide, please. And as in previous years, respondents from also shared their views on global risks over a 10-year horizon, with the top concerns shown here by likelihood and impact. I doubt anyone is surprised to see infectious diseases up there among those long-term risks. But if you track this scatter plot over the years, you'll see that interest in pandemics reflects a traditional panic neglect cycle, even though the 5 of the last 6 global risk reports have highlighted the shortcomings in global preparedness. I think more consistent with recent years is this dominance of environmental risks in the top right corner, this time actually stretching even further in that direction. And while regulations may be tightening, the US back in the Paris Agreement, and investor priorities shifting, 2020 was still the joint hottest year on record, and national commitments to emissions cuts have a long way to go to put us on a 1.5-degree pathway. And then in that next band of concerns, we see cybersecurity and the concentration of digital power and international friction. Then after that, those lasting pressures on livelihoods and social cohesion. And now over to Jackie to unpack some of those socioeconomic issues.
Thank you so much, Richard, and it's great to be with everyone here this afternoon or this morning, as the case may be. So let's talk about employment and livelihood. There's a confluence of events or factors that are really bringing this to the top of the risk list today. So first, the pandemic. And what we've discovered throughout the pandemic that we really knew all along, but was really reinforced, which is that we live in a divided society. And there are many of us who, through COVID, there are moments that were difficult, but we were able to hang on to our jobs, work from the safety of our home, and in many ways, have the most important elements of our life stay in place. There were others who either had to put themselves at risk when they went to work or who lost their jobs. And so coming out of the pandemic, understanding that we've really opened up the curtains and put on great display inequity in our society, and recognizing that there are people who we have left behind and what are we going to do about it? That's certainly a really important factor. Conversations about race that we have never had before, highlighting the systemic issues that exist in our society, and again, who we're leaving behind. And then understanding as well that going into the pandemic, we were facing across many developed countries, and certainly Canada is one of them, the start of a real concern about a talent drought, not having the talent and the individuals that we need to drive our economy forward in certain sectors. So what does that all mean? Well, it means that more than ever, we cannot afford to leave anyone behind, either from a moral perspective or from a very practical perspective. So what do we do about that? The final thing that I'll mention is that this is a risk that's very much on the minds of leaders, but it is also on the minds of our people. And we know that millennials especially, and the generations that follow them, care deeply about inequity and want to work for organizations that also are really concerned about inequity and trying to do something about it. They want to work in a diverse environment. That's something that's just a given for them. So making sure from all those perspectives that we start to addressing these inequities is really, really important. Next slide. I found some of these statistics to be really interesting. So for example, 63% of executives are reporting that they're being held accountable for DE&I. But only 17% of organizations report that they're enforcing accountability where it really matters, in the pocketbooks of executives. So a little bit of a disconnect there, and we're going to be talking about that a little later on. Reinforcing the point that diversity matters to your employees, and that we are increasingly seeing individuals, particularly younger individuals, move to corporations where they feel that those organizations are aligned in terms of purpose with what those individuals would like to do, and also aligned in terms of perspective on inequality and trying to close the gap that exists with respect to inequality. And when we're talking about inequality, I know I started by talking about race and socioeconomic status, but we also have to remember the deep inequalities that we're still facing in terms of gender, even in developed parts of the world, disability, for those of us that may identify as other than heterosexual, veteran status, and inequality in terms of ageism. So making sure that we focus on those inequalities, we figure out how to incorporate everybody and create a welcoming environment for everyone in our workforce, that continues to be a top priority. Next slide. So how might we go about doing that? Well, let's start with having engaged and passionate leadership that truly believe that having a diverse workforce is just, there's no question about it anymore. We have to get there. Passion is great, but rooting any DE&I strategy in data and in proof and in some science is critical as well. You cannot move forward if you don't know where you're coming from. You cannot move forward unless you understand along the journey how you're doing. If you have the right data, then you can start to understand where the choke points are in your organization and in the journeys of your individuals. And if you don't, that's going to be really challenging. Let me address explicitly the fact that in Canada, we tend to have good data on gender, but there's some elements of diversity where there's a lack of data. So for example, on race. And so we're seeing many organizations embark on self-identification campaigns in order to try and close that gap. I'll talk next about accountability. The journey is difficult. It's difficult. And it's all too easy to fall back on the tried and true. So if we expect to make progress on this journey, holding our leaders accountable, measuring progress, having that have an impact on how we view our executives is really, really critical. And finally, let's talk a little bit about action. So if you have passionate leaders, if you have the data and proof, if you are holding those leaders accountable, you are much more likely to see actual action taken. For years, for decades, for hundreds of years actually, we've been working within a system that was largely created to enable a workforce that was composed of heterosexual white men. So unpacking all the implicit biases in the system, it's not going to be easy. So what kinds of things can you do? Well, I'll give one example, which is job descriptions. So we know that men and women and some visible minorities look at the ideas of opportunity and promotion in different ways than men or white men in particular might view them. So women and, for example, Black women will take a look at a job description and see 20 suggestions for this is what we're looking for, interpret those as requirements, and they may not apply unless they have 19 out of 20 of the qualifications that they see advertised. White men will often look and say, hey, I've got 5 of those things, but I really believe I can do this job, and they'll apply. So how you write the job description, whether you put in all kinds of extraneous, what you might think are suggestions, what others might interpret as being requirements, that can have a real impact on who applies for a job, and you may be inadvertently excluding key individuals that you would want to consider for your workforce of the future. So lots and lots of things to think about there. Next slide. Finally, I'll leave you with this. It's really unusual now to talk to any leader who does not say that DE&I, that reducing inequality is high on their radar. The question is, do you have the right strategy in place to actually be successful? And this brings me to what I like to call the say and do gap. So we see that globally, 81% of the organizations that we surveyed said they're really focused on DE&I. But when we ask, what's your strategy to get there? Only 42% could articulate that they actually have a real strategy. In Canada, it's only 30% of the organizations that we surveyed that said they have an actual strategy. So I'll leave you with a suggestion that we have some work to do, but it is worthwhile work, and look forward to the journey. And with that, I'm gonna turn things over to Anya, who will talk about climate risk.
Thank you, Jackie. The pandemic has shown us that we're very vulnerable to disruption, and that one type of event can generate all kinds of complex and broad consequences. Climate change, not surprisingly, is no different. It impacts the entire planet at once and is very linked to other major risk categories of concern. For today, we're going to talk about extreme weather events, which is one aspect of climate change. And then Rob Bailey is going to talk to us about transition risks associated with trying to reduce carbon footprints. Next slide, please. So first of all, why does climate change mean that we are concerned about extreme weather events? In general, when we think about climate change, we think of it as a gradual increase in temperature, in average temperature. However, climate scientists agree that climate change also brings about an increase in the variability of weather, which means it's more unpredictable. And this is relatively intuitive. The hotter the air, the more moisture it can absorb and hold, and therefore the more power weather systems can generate and the more extremes we will see. And unfortunately, this means that across the gamut of meteorological perils, projections are that each and every one of them is on the rise. Observations to date bear that out. And when it comes to the heat itself, this can take the form of heat waves, wildfires, and droughts. When we're looking at extreme precipitation, obviously this can result in flooding. In some cases, more thunderstorms can form and cause greater wind gusts, more hail, and more tornado. There's less consensus in this area with respect to hail and tornado, but we do know that the summer is going to be longer. And I like to think of it as a hockey game. If you add an extra period, are you definitely going to see more goals? Not necessarily, but it's relatively intuitive that it's probably going to happen. There's more opportunity for these extreme events. And these first three categories of perils are of the greatest concern in Canada. We've seen the most extreme economic consequences from wildfire, flooding, and hailstorms in Canada. And so we need to pay special attention to those. However, we also know that sea level rise is a consequence of climate change, and we will see increased coastal flooding, sometimes in the case, sometimes manifesting as storm surge as a result of hurricanes. Sea surface temperatures drive the frequency and the intensity of hurricanes, and we know that that is rising as well. And so we'll see more active seasons with more major events on the Atlantic coast. And unfortunately, the winter doesn't represent much of a break. We're going to see that the snow density is going to increase, meaning that the snow will be wetter. So for a given amount of snowfall, it will be heavier, which will put pressure on roofs and the like. And likewise, we'll see an increase in freezing rain systems and the mayhem that we all know that causes. Next slide. In terms of where that is going to occur in Canada, the coastal events are obviously going to occur on the coasts. I mentioned hurricanes on the Atlantic coast, storm surge on both sides, and over time, coastal erosion. In terms of heat, that is a widespread Canada-wide phenomenon. In the urban center is manifesting mostly as heat waves, in rural and agricultural areas as drought, and in forested areas as wildfire. Flooding, likewise, is going to occur across this great country of ours, perhaps less frequently, but with greater intensity, and can generate significant landslides as well as a result. And I did mention already the longer season for hail and tornadoes, which occur generally in the western half of the country, mostly in the prairies and in southwestern Ontario. There's also the potential over time for the regions impacted by these events to extend northward as the permafrost line moves with climate change. Moving to what we can do, there's no surprises here on this slide. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the various actions that can be taken at all levels and must be taken at all levels to combat this or prepare for this. Focusing on what companies can do, the theme is resilience. And I would just point out that building codes are meant to minimize loss of life. They're not necessarily focused on maintaining structural integrity or fitness for purpose. So that's something to bear in mind when reviewing your operations. But another thing that I think is often neglected in terms of building resiliency is strategic redundancies in the form of diversification and strategic investing. And it really pertains, if I take a concrete example that we're experiencing today, water levels in the St. Lawrence Seaway are very low. And as a result, shipping lines that are shipping through the Port of Montreal are surcharging because they need to essentially lessen the load of each vessel. So the weight, the vessel is less heavy and they're able to use the port, which means that spillover needs to be serviced by other vessels. And in some instances, there are not enough ships in the fleet to take that overspill. So to the extent that, diversifying your supply chain is a very concrete example of ways in which climate change, with not necessarily a specific event in mind, is still having consequences today on our businesses and on our economy. I'll have to hand it over to Rob Bailey to talk a little bit about the transition risks associated with moving to or trying to reduce carbon emissions.
Thanks, Anya. So the first point I want to make about transition risk is that climate change only stops when globally we get to net zero emissions. And this is the case whether we stabilize temperatures at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, or heaven forbid, even 4 degrees. The only real question is how quickly we get there. And that's where the risk and uncertainty arises. It's the speed of that pathway and the route that we take to net zero emissions. Now, we're now at a point where 2/3 of the global economy has set or is covered by net zero targets that have been set by governments. And just to give you a sense of the pace of the decarbonisation that's needed, in order to stabilise temperatures at 1.5 degrees, we need to get to net zero emissions by the middle of the century. And as you can see from the graph on the left of this slide, that essentially means that we have to peak emissions now, immediately, and begin a very rapid decline to net zero in order to get there. Now, the current set of pledges that governments have made to reduce emissions by 2030, as you can also see from the slide there with the purple dotted line, are not nearly enough to achieve this. And so one of the key focuses of the COP26 climate negotiations that are going to be happening at the end of this year in Glasgow is going to be about closing that ambition gap between what's needed to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and what governments have actually pledged. Now, to put that in perspective, that would require a 5-fold increase in the ambition of 2030 targets in order for us to be on track for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the implication of that clearly is that there's huge potential scope for regulations and policies governing emissions to tighten very significantly. Now, as with climate impacts, this is not a risk just about what's going to happen in the future over the horizon. We're actually seeing transition risks crystallizing today, and we can look at some of those on the next slide. So just to give you a sense, really, these are all headlines that have come from the last couple of months globally. Okay, so in the European Union, for example, we're now at a point where carbon prices have risen above 50 euros a ton. That's about 75 Canadian dollars. And there are conversations, live conversations, advanced conversations about the EU's plans to impose a carbon border adjustment tax on imports from countries with less stringent climate regulations in order to protect European industries. We've seen a flurry of net zero commitments in the financial services space from banks, from asset owners, from asset managers and insurers, covering more than 70 trillion of financial assets. There are more companies that are setting these targets beyond those that have announced them in those initiatives, and indeed Oliver Wyman is working with a number of them on precisely this topic. Now, for businesses, this creates opportunities for those that can align themselves with the Paris Agreement and set ambitious targets to reach net zero by 2050 or sooner. Oliver Wyman's work with CDP in Europe, for example, identified that there was a 4 trillion euro surplus of banking capital looking for lending opportunities with companies that have aligned their strategies to Paris. So that means that those companies can expect to receive preferable financing rates, for example. The flip side of that, of course, is that businesses which are not aligned with the Paris Agreement over time can increasingly expect to see their costs of capital increase as investors and banks and insurers look for businesses which are more closely aligned with the Paris Agreement. Very recently, the G7 in Cornwall in the UK announced that they were supporting mandatory climate risk disclosures for listed companies. This proposal, we understand, will now go to the G20, which of course is what kick-started the whole task force on climate-related financial disclosures in the first place. And the UK, we understand, is also hoping to secure some kind of an international agreement on mandating climate risk disclosures around about the end of the year for COP26. So the regulatory environment for climate risk and reporting is definitely tightening on a very short timeline. And we're seeing, of course, increasing investor activism and litigation against companies in relation to climate change. For example, we're seeing litigation against companies requesting damages for climate impacts. We're seeing litigation against companies for not properly disclosing climate risks, litigation for not properly managing climate risks and therefore putting shareholder value at risk. And most recently, a successful litigation case in The Hague in the Netherlands against a company for not fulfilling its duty of care by not setting stringent enough voluntary emissions reductions goals, which is really quite something. So on the next slide, we can just reflect a little bit on what this means for executives and boards in corporates. And I think, you know, there's two key messages here that I would make. The first is that response needs to be comprehensive, but it also needs to be coherent. It needs to be comprehensive because this issue really touches all parts of the business. It has implications for strategy, it has implications for risk, it has implications for finance and treasury, it has implications for reporting and shareholder engagement and investor management, and it has implications for the workforce, as we were hearing just with the earlier remarks on DE&I. We're also seeing evidence that a company's environmental performance is increasingly a strong source of attraction and retention for talent. But it also needs to be coherent. And that is because businesses must increasingly balance a range of diverse stakeholders with different and evolving expectations about how they're going to behave in terms of reducing their own emissions and navigating the transition. That includes investors, but it also includes banks, it includes the staff, business customers, which are increasingly setting requirements for companies in their supply chains to meet in terms of net zero emissions, consumers, which are where we're seeing changing expectations, what they expect from companies, how they expect companies to behave and present themselves, and regulators. And this means that businesses need to have a coherent, consistent approach in how they're dealing with this to avoid embarrassing inconsistencies in their response. So I'll stop there And I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan, who is going to discuss cyber risks. Jonathan.
Thanks, Rob, and good afternoon to everyone on the line. Cyber attacks are among some of the most severe and likely risks facing business leaders in advanced economies. Further heightening this risk for businesses, in 2020, the world experienced an unprecedented level of societal, economical, and geopolitical upheaval brought on in part by the COVID-19 public health crisis. Cybersecurity will remain an enduring focus and responsibility for businesses for several reasons. First, COVID-19 has forced many businesses to transition to a remote workforce, presenting an expanded attack surface for cyber criminals to exploit. This is something that will persist well beyond the current crisis. Second, the pace of technological development has continued to rapidly advance. Artificial intelligence is enhancing both the effectiveness and the peril of traditional cyber threats, while other emerging technologies increasingly create unforeseen vulnerabilities in novel ways. Whether we're speaking about deep fakes or voice-based digital assistants or other IoT devices and more. Finally, many firms operate in complex supply chains that expose them to third parties which may not have the resources to maintain the same level of focus on cyber risk management. This interdependency heightens the challenge of maintaining cyber resilience across the ecosystem. Given these factors, business leaders recognize that cyber is a risk that must be identified, quantified, and managed, but it's also one that cannot be entirely eliminated. A cohesive cyber strategy is required, one which keeps pace with technological development in an environment of increasing digital seamlessness and data ubiquity, and also considers human elements necessary to promote good cyber hygiene, such as culture, awareness, and technology enablement and support. In the coming year, the cyber landscape will be more complex than ever. Driven by the COVID-19 pandemic, businesses have greatly accelerated their digital transformation efforts. From healthcare organizations to government agencies to manufacturing companies and really every industry in between, the rapid shift to remote work has generally created wider attack surfaces and less secure environments. Ransomware is on the rise rather, increasing in frequency, severity, and sophistication. And with increasing attacks come higher financial and operational impacts. And these can include things like ransomware payments and investigation costs, operational downtime and remediation efforts. It's estimated that there has been a 148% increase in attacks, and total global ransomware recovery costs are predicted at $20 billion by the end of 2021. If we look at some of the numbers, in Q4 2020, the average resulted downtime from ransomware events is now up to 21 days. Data exfiltration is also becoming increasingly common as a coercion tactic with ransomware attacks to incentivize the actual payment of the ransom. In Q4 2020, more than 70% of ransomware attacks involved the threat of data exfiltration. As a result, organizations are not only struggling with more ransomware attacks, but there's now that added privacy implication of data exfiltration. The average number of ransomware attacks that occurred daily since January 2016 is now 4,000. And another interesting fact is that 1 in 3,000 emails contain some form of malware. And I can speak for myself where sometimes it feels like I send 3,000 emails in a day. So really the odds are not in our favor. A few moments ago, I mentioned that supply chain risk heightens the challenge of maintaining cyber resilience. As we see more attacks on critical technology vendors and organizations' digital supply chains, it's more important than ever to define what is meant by digital supply chain, how the term is understood within your organization, and what types of cyber risk manifest from your critical third-party vendors and digital supply chain. Many organizations struggle to understand their complex digital supply chains and the myriad of vendor relationships that support their operations, especially those that have access to your IT or OT systems or data. Regardless of how it's defined, the expansion of a company's digital supply chain brings increased cyber risk. While supply chain cyber attacks can't all be prevented, they can be identified and managed to reduce the impact. Supply chain resilience can be achieved through identification and understanding of the risks, planning for when an attack actually happens, and finding the right balance between risk mitigation and risk transfer. And I guess the big question is, why are threat actors even targeting supply chains? These types of attacks present threat actors with enormous opportunities for exploitation. A successful attack against even a single vendor or supplier, which we've seen very recently, can yield sensitive data across multiple organizations. In 2020, 700 organizations were affected by third-party or supply chain compromises. And when we speak to global leaders, 39% of them believe that supply chain partners pose a high risk to their organizations. And 43% of leaders report no confidence in their ability to prevent third-party cyber threats. And on top of that, there's been a 430% increase in attacks against software supply chain between 2019 and 2020. So threat actors are paying attention to where they can leverage their strength, and they are playing on those strengths. Organizations need to de-risk and adapt to the new normal. This requires a thorough evaluation of pandemic-driven IT and cybersecurity challenges, some of which are rapidly put in place during the response phase of the pandemic. Things such as effective incident response planning, updated cybersecurity policies, employee training, and secure collaboration tools will be more important than ever. With cyber remaining a top risk concern for organizations, continued financial investment in cyber-focused organizational culture will become key to combating the continuously evolving threats faced by companies around the world. Through the sharing of information, companies and industries can continue to build awareness of both cyber threats and strategies to drive societal change in how we view and address cyber risks. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Richard, for some more thoughts.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think to try and bring this to a close now, I think if ever there was a year for companies appreciating the need to grapple with major contingencies, complex uncertainties, and strategic emerging threats, 2020 was it. And therefore 2021 is surely the year to ensure that this aspect of risk is truly part of the DNA of our organizations. And so it seems useful to close with a few broader reflections on organizational preparedness. First, there's been a lot of risk discussion over the years about correlated risks, black swans, and complex spillover effects. The last year, though, has really pressed us to appreciate the likelihood of concurrent crises and the validity of more extreme scenarios and the existence of ignored tail risks in our risk registers that have been lurking there all this time. I mean, one of my colleagues recently ran a crisis management test for a client that involved a cyber attack happening at the same time as a hurricane at a time of pandemic. The client was initially resistant and then got behind it, and somewhat bizarrely, that exact scenario happened about 3 weeks later. But second, we're even more aware now that resilience isn't a fixed standard that can be validated by a tick box exercise, but it's an evolving, active process where organizational muscles are stretched and honed, where decision trade-offs between agility, efficiency, and robustness can be flexed with confidence, even when data and intelligence are weak. Yes, it's about good options analysis, but it's also about a strong strategic risk culture led from the top. And third, as we look to the next 12 to 18 months, while it's going to be crucial to have one eye on the new near-term surprises and setbacks, the other should be as firmly on those longer-term transformations. And if firms only do the former, the prize of survival may just be obsolescence. I throw out the possibility that countries and maybe companies that have suffered less through the pandemic may be more on the back foot with regard to innovation. And fourth, organizations need to find the right balance between human capital and technological capital and anticipate the associated risks accordingly. I think no question that technology and data have underpinned national responses to the pandemic and enabled us all to keep working during the crisis, and that companies' digital agenda have accelerated hugely over the past year. But the ability to reshape working practices and motivate employees and retain talent in the recovery is going to be critical for ongoing success. The next slide, please. So that really sort of brings the presentations to a close, and we'll shortly start the Q&A segment. So please submit questions or observations into the Q&A function now. But before that, it would be great to understand from those on this call about your particular concerns, and I think be useful for everyone, I think. So the question that we've been asking in different countries is now on the screen. which of the following presents the greatest risk for your organization over the next 2 years? And please check one item. International trade, industry disruption, workforce disruption, changes in consumer demand and purchasing behaviors, new technology adoption, cyber attacks, or transition to a low carbon economy. And Colleen will put the results up on the screen when responses begin to slow down. So please answer now if you haven't already. We'll just give this a few more moments. Okay, so the leading results, quite a mixed group here, but certainly workforce disruption coming out as the top, I think closely followed by cyber attacks. And then some of the others fairly sort of in similar places below that. So that is interesting that the workforce agenda there is perceived by this group to be some of the things that they are most concerned about going forwards. So thank you very much, everyone, for that. So moving on to the next slide. As I mentioned, this is a question that we've been asking every now and again in different parts of the world over the past few months. And here you can see a consolidated view of those results. Changes in consumer demand and purchasing behaviors was most frequently cited. And until recently, that was actually 7 points ahead of the others. And then we have cyber risk, workforce disruption, and industry disruption, very similar in the next tier of answers. And interestingly, views have been pretty consistent across the US, Europe, and Southeast Asia. The main outlier actually has been Australia, where international trade and cyber attacks were sort of 15 points ahead of everything else. But thank you very much for the responses to that. And now hand it back to Sarah.
Thanks very much, Richard. Very much appreciate that, and I very much appreciate the audience participation as well in the question. Interesting responses as they vary slightly by jurisdiction. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A panel, the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, or if you would like, you can enter them in the chat panel as well. There was a question about whether or not the recording would be available, and yes, the recording will be sent out afterwards, and so you will be able to have that recording to be able to listen to and delve into in more detail. So we've had a few questions that have come in already, and so why don't we get started with those? Jackie, there's a very good question on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the question is this: what's your view of including DEI goals in executive performance scorecards and ultimately into the determination of executive bonuses?
So my view is just do it. That's my view. You know, as I said in my presentation, this is hard work. And we have, I think most organizations really want to do the right thing. But we are trying to unpack and change a system that was really built for a different time. And if you measure progress and you hold people accountable you know, where it matters in their pocketbooks, I think you get creative and you think of solutions. So I say, let's go there.
Great, thanks very much for that view. Over to Richard. There's a question about resilience, and reads as follows: doesn't an experience like the COVID-19 pandemic provide an opportunity to rethink resilience at a national level, not just at an organizational level?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it's very much, sharpened questions about the efficacy of national approaches to grappling with emerging risks and crises. And it's been fascinating watching how countries have performed over the last year. And there's no need to sort of look at some of the details of that, and at which points they've got it right and which points they've got it, wrong, and how that has sort of affected things politically as well. And indeed, if one even just looks at it at a technical level, the sense that actually what seemed good on paper just simply hasn't stacked up in reality by way of preparedness. So very much looking at, so I think it really is sparking this new conversation about the quality of our anticipation, our true preparedness, and our decision-making approaches, and the trade-offs that we make as countries, or that our politicians make, and our agility to adapt to changing circumstances, and also our willingness to make some of the preemptive investment in some of the big issues as well. And it's not just about capabilities. It's also leads to further questions about the balance of responsibilities between government, private sector, and households, and what is expected of each group as the risk landscape gets more complicated and the risks get bigger and vulnerabilities change. And also how we move from that sense of a vision about the imperative of resilience to the strategy through to that sort of meaningful execution to ensure that things actually work in due course. And I mean, the pandemic has really sort of put governments in the driving seat now in a way that perhaps they were less so before. And some are very much showing evidence of new thinking in this area. And certainly the UK is about to undertake a big sort of resilience strategy review. But I think the mood music is also favorable in the corporate sector as well. And we are seeing businesses looking at this as part of their way of blending profit and purpose, commerce and sustainability in a form of responsible capitalism. So I think now is very much the time to get this right from a national level as well as from an organizational level too.
Thanks. There's no time like the present to truly try and get it right, is there? So Anya, there's a question here on climate change and the impacts to Canada. How can there simultaneously be an increased risk of drought as well as inland flooding?
That's an excellent question, and I agree that seems counterintuitive or even contradictory. Well, first of all, it can happen at different times, or different seasons, or different years. Also, we have a massive country, so that can happen in different regions of the country. But believe it or not, it can happen in the same location in the same season. Unfortunately, the one can exacerbate the other. If you have prolonged heat and lack of moisture, followed by intense rainfall, the topsoil is dried out. In some cases, it's hardened and even cracked, and it behaves essentially like a paved surface. And so you have accelerated runoff, the water doesn't infiltrate into the soil, and you get very, very dramatic flooding depending on the location. So it's something that really, given, in my presentation, I talked about the ubiquity of the heat risk and the precipitation risk. It's something that can really impact any part of our country.
Thanks, and I'm sure a number of people saw on today's front page of the Globe and Mail that our tick seasons in Canada is even getting worse now, and no longer just a rural menace. With the climate getting warmer, the range of the ticks that cause Lyme disease, something else that we're now going to have to worry about as well. So daily impacts that we're seeing. It's hard, Jonathan, to talk about risk without talking about cyber insurance. And so not surprisingly, there's a question here about how does cyber insurance tie into an overall cyber risk management strategy? And is it the right solution for every organization? And so the other part to the question is, what do I need to have in place before purchasing cyber insurance?
Great question, and it's a question I probably hear on a daily basis. My view, and I think Marcia's view, is that cyber insurance can play a critical role in any organization's cyber risk management strategy or plan. I think it's a matter of how you utilize that insurance. So insurance can be an effective risk transfer option in the sense of having access to capital, but it can also be an excellent tool, and specifically when we're looking at cyber, in gaining access to certain expertise or specialisms when it comes to dealing with cyber attacks themselves. So whether it's getting access to information security vendors like a forensics firm, or a firm that can assist with the negotiation or payment of a ransomware incident, cyber insurance has become key for many organizations in order to execute upon those things. Is it the right solution for every organization? I would say in some way, shape, or form, yes. It's just a matter of what phase in your risk management journey you're on. To answer the second question about what you need to have in place before purchasing cyber insurance, there is no magic combination of governance and controls that prepares you to purchase cyber insurance. What insurers really want the opportunity to assess is really the culture at an organization, and then the baseline controls that are in place. So having things in place like employee training is very good, and then having things like multi-factor authentication and ensuring that privileged access is controlled or limited in certain ways within the organization are great first steps. But you know, at Marsh, we're always happy to have a broader discussion about what's required and how we can help you get cyber insurance in place if necessary.
Some great advice. Thanks, Jonathan. And then Rob, question on transition risks. How have transition risks changed during the pandemic?
That's a good question. You know, I think it's very hard to kind of make generalizations, and I think that the answer I would give is that companies really need to figure that out through a process of scenario analysis. I mean, scenario analysis is a really key part of the toolkit for understanding and managing climate risks. It's a big part of the TCFD's recommendations on what businesses need to do and the kind of information they need to make available to investors. So I think the key thing is to identify what are the questions that companies need to ask themselves as part of that scenario analysis process. So how has the regulatory environment changed as a result of the pandemic? You know, are stimulus packages favoring green or brown stimulus measures? For example, in the US, there's a big conversation at the moment about the infrastructure plan and the extent to which that will favor certain technologies or types of infrastructure. In the European Union, we've had a big debate about the extent to which bailouts for airlines should impose green conditionalities on the businesses. And the European Union, of course, is aligning its pandemic recovery package with its with what it calls its Green Deal, its package of measures to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. So there's a whole bunch of regulatory things that companies will need to unpack or unpick depending upon their sector and their geography. Similar questions about how the prospects for different technologies have changed as a result of the pandemic. You know, one thing that we've seen is that renewable technologies have performed much stronger than expected. When electricity demand fell, we saw effectively the penetration of renewable technologies on grids rise very dramatically in certain regions like Europe, you know, getting north of 30% without any problems for the grids, which I think has made people feel a lot more confident about really scaling up investment in renewables, but also thinking about complementary technologies like battery storage that will be needed. Hydrogen is another one that seems to have come out of the pandemic with a lot of policy support and interest, and is likely to see some movement there. Questions about how consumer attitudes and public attitudes towards climate change and climate action have evolved. You know, there's polling evidence that suggests that people are now more supportive of cooperative big policy interventions across government and between governments, more support for international action on this kind of an agenda. So I think those are some of the things that the businesses should probably be looking at in trying to answer that question.
Thanks, Rob. That's a terrific summary of some of the areas to consider. Well, unfortunately, I see that our time is just about up. And so first of all, I'd like to thank our panelists for their insights into the critical global risks affecting our businesses and society today. It's clear that our ability to better anticipate and address emerging threats will require greater resilience on the part of individuals, businesses, and governments alike. So I encourage all of our attendees to take some time to review the Global Risk Report. By keeping an eye on potentially high impact events across the risk landscape, and by evolving into a more prepared and responsive organizations, you'll be better able to enhance your resilience and successfully navigate the risks and the opportunities that are ahead as well. There's been a couple of questions in the chat looking for a recording, and yes, we'll send a link to the report along with the recording of today's session. So thank you so much to everybody for taking the time to join us today. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.